day out there, it really is. And we want to enjoy it. I appreciated Jimmy's prayer, particularly the part that where we get to spend this hour together. I appreciate that. I appreciate Blackie leading my father's favorite song. And he probably hadn't led it in a month, and so he was going to get in trouble if he didn't lead it pretty quick. But that, I know Daddy would have got on. But that, I appreciate it. It always brings back good memories. It does.
I think you'll remember time.
I
I'll do it.
I do. Cecil and Dee? Anybody heard anything on Cecil and Dee? I mean, I know he'd been in the hospital, but I haven't heard anything. Okay. And Kelly Reekin, I think, is doing better. About to get out of the hospital. I appreciated this congregation's attendance at Suzanne's funeral. It was good that we gave her, I know we sent her cards, things like that, but to support the family that way, I appreciate that. That there was, I think it was needed yesterday, that they needed some support, and always in those type of situations, people need support, and I'm glad that we did. And I appreciate everyone. Also, this afternoon, we're going to have our evening services at 4 o'clock. Kim made that decision, I think.
TV just went on.
Dad,
Oh, is it? It did. I'm just gonna. We're gonna let it go.
Oh, wow.
Just let it go. Not try to mess with it. We will. I may read off of it, but that's all right. Oh, we had that picture though, didn't we?
Yeah, yeah. Picture.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things. It seems like I'm missing an announcement somewhere, but it'll probably come to me in the middle. We'll just stop in the middle and do that. But you know, one of the things is I don't like tomatoes. I really don't. I don't like to eat them. I don't like to watch other people eat them. And I know that sounds weird, because growing up, we raised a lot of tomatoes. We had enough tomatoes out there to feed the county. Mother would eat tomatoes like apples, just several a day, just eat them. And I never even liked to watch that. And I know that sounds weird. Tomato sauce doesn't bother me too much, but tomatoes just don't like them. And I've always kind of wondered why. And one of the things is when I was a kid, my Uncle Bud Culpepper from Gould, Oklahoma, he was one of my favorite people. And he didn't say a lot, but I liked him. And he would tell the story that when he was a young man, he was in World War I. And when he got drafted and he went to France, in Gould, before he left, he was a mechanic. He had a little filling station there, and he was a mechanic there, young man, but still, that's what he did. And when he went to France, he was a mechanic. And he was a mechanic for a convoy, a whole convoy of trucks, that it was the supply trucks. And they would take supplies to the front line, and it was his responsibility to maintain those trucks. But when they were in operation, he was a truck driver, and he would drive one of the trucks when he wasn't working on them. And one time they're on their way to the front with supplies, and they get attacked by the Germans. And when they get hit, both by air and I think some ground forces, he gets separated from the rest of his convoy. And he gets behind German lines. And he's there in France, and he's behind German lines. And he takes his truck, and he finds this farm that had been bombed. But there was a house and a barn that had both been bombed, but he could get his truck underneath the roof of the barn. And so he got that truck underneath there, and he hid. And because it had looked like it was bombed out, they just kind of went on by it. And he hid there for 9 days. And then the lines shifted again, and he ended up on the Allied side of the lines, and everything was okay. He was fine. But for 9 days, he was in that bombed out barn with nothing but what he had in his truck. And it turns out that what he was hauling to the front was canned tomatoes. And so he lived for 9 days on nothing but canned tomatoes. And I've heard him say, I will never eat another tomato as long as I live. And so I think sometimes that is partly why I don't like tomatoes, is listening to that story. But at one time, Kay and I were going over to a very nice lady's house. And it was a dinner party. And what we had was gazpacho, which is cold tomato soup. And so, my mother told me that when you go to somebody's house for a dinner party, you eat whatever's in front of you and you tell them you liked it and it was very good. And we did. I ate it. And now Kay will tell you that it looked like I was turning green, but I did. And we got through it. Because, Mother taught us that if you're at a dinner party, you eat what's in front of you. You are nice to the host, the hostess. You don't criticize anybody there. You just maintain what's going on and be polite. And we've been looking at Christ at dinner parties in Luke. And sometimes Jesus would not be a particularly polite dinner guest. There are times that we saw when he went to Levi's house that he criticized and confronted the other guests about why they were chastising him for eating with tax collectors and sinners. When he goes to Simon the Pharisee's house to eat, he confronts Simon directly and is not particularly polite to him. But he teaches. He takes the opportunity to teach. And we saw last week when he was at Martha and Mary's house, he takes the opportunity to teach Martha. And he tells her, Martha, Martha, why are you so distracted by so many things? Mary has chosen the better things. So even the hostess, Jesus is willing to criticize and take, not I don't criticize, but to teach. Maybe that's a better phrase, to teach. But we've looked at these examples where Jesus is taking a meal and where he is and using that as a time to teach, which was a very common thing in this day and age, as people ate together most nights. When you consider, particularly if you had meat, which I don't think was a common occurrence, you didn't have refrigeration. You couldn't put the leftovers in the refrigerator for a later date. It was good if you ate it all up. And if you butchered an animal, you probably had to invite your friends in to get it all eaten so that none went to waste. So it was very common that you would have a communal meal. And it was also very common that you would talk and that you would have instruction. You might have somebody invited in to talk. We've talked about that. But Jesus would take this opportunity at a meal to teach and to work, and not always be concerned about whether he was following all the rules of politeness. We've also seen, as we've looked at this series of meals, how Jesus continually expands the kingdom. When he's at Levi's house, they're saying, why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? And he tells them, I'm here to call the sick, not the well. And then when we have the woman with the bad reputation, he talks to them about how that she has worshipped him with her tears and her hair and the oil and her kissing. That she's the one worshiping him. He expands that kingdom. Last week with Mary and Martha, we see that Mary is seated at Jesus' feet as a woman. And that was kind of scandalous, that a woman was there as a disciple listening to Jesus. She's not there just doing women's work. Sometimes I think it's not so much what Mary was doing, it was what she was not doing. But Jesus is expanding that kingdom to include more people. And he does that over and over and over. And we're going to again look at another meal today. We're going to look at Luke chapter 14. And we're going to look at, this is what we call the Great Banquet. And before we get, our text is going to be 12 through 24. But before we get to that, we're going to look at the first verse. And I'm going to read this out of the Message of chapter 14. I just like the way it reads. And yes, it was supposed to be up here, but my technological abilities are gone today. One time, when Jesus went for a Sabbath meal with one of the top leaders of the Pharisees, all the guests had their eyes on him, watching his every move. So when this chapter begins, Jesus has gone to a meal with one of the leading Pharisees. This is one of the elite, the religious elite. And everybody at this meal is watching his every move. Which reminds me of that time we went to that dinner party and we had the gazpacho. As I felt like everybody was watching me eat. No, people were not. But it makes you feel that way. And sometimes we know that people are watching our every move. All the time. Even when we don't realize it. People are watching. They're watching us because we're Christians. They may be watching us because we're the judge, or whatever it may be, or the child of a judge sometimes can. They may be watching you because of that. That it happens, that people pay attention. But Jesus was sitting there and all the eyes were on him and waiting for him to teach. Jesus has several messages in this chapter. And we're only going to look at the one that we call the Great Banquet. And so we're going to begin our reading today in verse 12, the parable of the Great Banquet. He said also to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. When one of those who reclined at the table with him heard these things, he said to him, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. But he said to him, a man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So the servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house became angry, and said to his servant, go out quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city, and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. And the servant said, sir, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room. And the master said to the servant, go out to the highways and the hedges, and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, that none of those men who are invited shall taste my banquet. Now first, Jesus gives us this parable about don't invite people who will invite you back. Invite the people who cannot invite you back. And in this time, first century Palestine, in the Jewish world, who you ate with was extremely important. Who you invited and who invited you. It gave you status. If you got to eat with the leaders of the community, that improved your status. If they came and ate with you, that would improve your status. So it's very important to everyone there who you ate with. And people did see who's eating at that man's house. Where is his influence? And if you ate with the blind and the crippled and the poor, that would certainly lower your status. And so when this man was going to give this banquet, we see that the quote that the one man says, blessed is those who eat in the banquet with the kingdom. What he's talking about here is back in Isaiah chapter 25, in other places. But Isaiah has predicted the Messiah, and he also predicts this great messianic banquet when the people will eat at the Lord's table. And this is Isaiah 25, 6 through 8. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. And the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken. And this is the banquet, the messianic banquet that the Jewish people are expecting. They're expecting the Messiah to come, and they're also expecting this great banquet. And when we look in Revelation, it's again referred to as the great banquet of the Lord, when all the tears will be dried and all the heartache will be done, and we'll all eat together with the banquet of the Lord. And so this one guy is thinking, I'm doing good here. I'm quoting scripture to Jesus. And Jesus turns on him a little bit. Again, maybe not the most polite dinner guest, but the great teacher. And he talks about this banquet. And we have this man who's invited all these guests. This would not have been a spur-of-the-moment affair. This would be more like you send out invitations to all your friends, and you expect to get an RSVP back, that yes, I'll be there. And then when the banquet is ready, they go back out and say, let's all come. And so when these people reject this invitation, it's not just a spur of the moment. The landowner, the man that's holding the feast, he's expecting them to be there, and then they don't come. This is very insulting to him. Almost a matter of ostracizing him, putting him out of the good society. And so he wants to have people at his banquet, and he sends them out to gather in everyone. The poor, the lame, the people that don't have a home. Bring them in. When we look at this, sometimes I think that we think the man is just being generous. And I certainly am not criticizing generosity. We should feed the hungry. But he's not just feeding them. He's inviting them into his home. He's inviting them to be part of his community. By bringing them in, he's associating with them. That he becomes as much part of their world as they become part of his. And one of the things is we have gone several times to Honduras and work with people down there. We build houses. We do various things. And one of the things is they do, and I guess they're not down there anymore. There may be other people doing this, but the people we went with are not down there anymore. They would go to the dump at Tegucigalpa, which is a horrible, horrible place. It is smelly, it is dirty, and people live in the dump because they dig through there, they get whatever food they can find, they look for something they can sell, and they make a living in the dump. There are other people that live outside the dump, but go into the dump every day to work, to just scavenge what they can. And that's their life. And the people that live in the dump, that's a hard life. The people we were going with, they would go to the dump once or twice a week. And usually when they would go, it would be a bag of water, not even a bottle of water, but a bag of water and a tortilla with beans. And that was the best meal those people got. But once a year, we would have what we called the Jesus banquet. We went several times. And it was at a little schoolyard. They would set up tables, and they would bring in grills. And it wouldn't be just beans and a tortilla, but it would be chicken and sausage and beef and rice, and and vegetables. And you would get a soda to drink, not just water, but a soda. And it was a good meal. It was a good meal for anybody. But we would invite people in. Whoever wanted to come would come. It was right there at the edge of the dump. And the people would come out of the dump, and we would probably feed 12 to 1,500 people. Many children that were in there. And that was always made you feel good. That there'd be people cooking, and then we were not the cooks. We were always the ones that would serve. But you would take plates of food to those people. And that was probably the best meal they would have all year. And it was a good program. It really was. And I'm going to compliment Kim, because Kim was always very good at working in the dump. She was. But one of the things about it, and I have a picture, but didn't work on the computer today, so we may look at that some other time. But the thing is at the end of that, we would go back to where we were staying, and then we would come back to McKnight, or Texas, where we were from. And those people would go back to the dump. Now, I don't want to suggest by any means that we didn't make an impact on those people, because we did. But we didn't invite them into our lives. And not practical. We couldn't bring them all back here. That just doesn't work. And so sometimes I think when we look at this parable of the banquet, we think of the people as just being generous. And we were being generous. But there's more to this banquet. It's about bringing people into your life. It's about reaching out and touching them. And Kay and I've had the discussion several times. And I've had other people ask me, it's expensive to fly to Honduras, and it is. If you would take that money and just send it down there, as opposed to you flying down there, you would probably have a greater impact. And Kay and I have talked about that it would probably, our impact would be bigger if we had just sent the money. And there's something to be said for that. I'm not arguing against that. The New Testament is full of examples where congregations gathered money and sent it to help people. That's a good thing. But number one, it wouldn't have been as good for us, because it made an impact on our lives. to go down there and to work. But also I think even in those people's lives, when you go and you spend time with them, and even though you may come back to the United States, and we did, there were people that we saw year after year, and they were always glad to see us. We recognized them. Kay much more than I. That Kay became very friendly with some of them, and they would be glad to see her every time. And so sometimes it's not just about either being generous with your money, it's about being generous with your life. And I think that's one of the things that we see in this parable. When Jesus is talking to them, it's not just about feeding people. It's not just about taking care of them. It's about giving of yourself, of making them part of your life. And I think that sometimes, I think we try, but I think sometimes, and I'm talking to myself, is I'm not very good at that. I'm much better at possibly writing a check than I am at giving of myself. And I think that is a caution that we see in this. Also, one of the things that we see, these three excuses specifically that we have. One of them is, I bought a piece of property and I need to go look at it. And at that time, land was the biggest security you had. If you had a piece of land, you had a little security. And so that was something that was good. Nothing wrong with that. The other man says, I got 5 yoke of oxen. That'd be like buying 5 tractors now. Big, expensive. That's something that would show wealth. If you had 5 yoke of oxen, if you could buy 5 yoke of oxen at one time, that showed that you had a lot of wealth. And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But there was something that came between them and the invitation. Whether it was the security or the wealth, or the last man that said, I've got a new wife, I cannot come. That family. And when we look today at things that come between us and our commitment to Christ, I think that they're the same. Is it our security, our retirement? Is it our bank account? Is it our relations with other people? Whatever that attachment may be that comes between us and Christ is something we need to be aware of. Because sometimes when Christ gives these, the poor, the lame, the blind, we see that those people have problems. They are oppressed in some way. They have a problem. And it's very obvious. But then there's those with the oxen and the land and the new wife. They need liberation just as much as those with the blindness or the lameness or the hunger. It's just they don't recognize it as much. And I think that goes to us. And I know that goes to me. Is that sometimes I don't recognize that my own need for Christ. And my need for Christ is at least as great, if not greater, than somebody out here who is in prison or doing something else. And is that we think that we are above that, and we are not. We all need the love and forgiveness of Christ, no matter who we are. And if we ever think that we are a little above that, that means that we have fallen. And I think the other thing that we look at this, and some of this is very personal. How do I handle this personally? And that's important. But also I think we need to look, how do we invite people to our banquet, Christ's banquet, that we do every week? And I think it's important to realize that this landowner, the feast man, the man that had the banquet, he just didn't open his doors and say, if anybody wants to come in, they can. He sent people out. He went out and brought people in. And I think that, again, that's something, speaking to myself, is that I'm not particularly good at, is going out and bringing people to the banquet. Christ has the banquet. It is here. He will be here with us today as the host. But we need to make sure that we are including as many as we can. That Christ spent all this time expanding the kingdom, expanding the kingdom. He defied expectations over and over. And I think that we want to make sure that we have not limited Christ's kingdom. But even more importantly, I think, is we need to understand that that invitation that the banquet man sent out, the host of the banquet, is Christ has sent that invitation out also. And how do we respond to Christ's invitation? As we see the example of the people that I had too much to do. I had to go do my oxen. I had to take care of my land. I had to take care of my family. The invitation is the same to us. The invitation to come, to join Christ in His kingdom is still there for us. And how we respond to that invitation is still as important today as it was in that first century. And let's not forget, it does come personal, but it also is as a group. How do we respond to that invitation to bring people, not just to open our doors and say, come on in, but to bring people to Christ, the ones that need that liberation. And that's something I want us to think about today, is how do we respond to that invitation? Because the Lord's invitation is here today. He's inviting us to come. He's inviting everyone to come. And that is our lesson today. Let's think about that invitation. And as we stand and sing, if you need anything, you would come forward.